Thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. Do you know when to advertise to someone? Do you know when you best perform in meetings and collaborations with others? Are you using science in order to think about timing? Daniel Pink is a keynote speaker and the author of 6 provocative books, including When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. When is a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Washington Post, and Publishers Weekly bestseller. When has also been a bestseller on Amazon for Best Business and Leadership Books in 2018. And on this episode, we'll discuss a lot of when questions for how you think about time, when you consider the timing of marketing campaigns and advertisements, and the rich body of evidence that gives us the facts and data in order to make better and smarter decisions of when to do things. So let's listen to a time when Mr. Pink spoke with Mr. Shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Dan, thank you so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective today. Tell us a little bit about your background and career thus far, please.
Well, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me. So my background, as briefly as possible, I grew up in Central Ohio, pretty middle-class, normal life, went to college, majored in linguistics, which is something I was really interested in. Graduated from college, worked a little bit, went to law school, didn't really love law school, decided not to practice law. Upon graduating from law school, I decided instead to work in politics, which is something that I was keenly interested in at the time. Became a political speechwriter, did that for a few years, and finally couldn't take it anymore, and eventually decided in my early 30s that what I wanted to do when I grew up was to be a writer. So I went out on my own to be a writer. Fortunately, I was married, and my wife had a job and a salary and health insurance when I did that, and that was about 20 years ago. And since then, I have written 6 books, really about a range of topics, from the rise of people working for themselves to what are the sorts of skills that are going to be necessary in a world of automation and outsourcing, to a graphic novel career guide, to a book on the science of motivation, to a book on the science of influence and persuasion, to the latest book, which is a book about the science of timing.
Well, then let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about your newest book, When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. You know, we met earlier this year, but I wanted to read your book before this interview, and I'm glad I did. When has been recognized by Amazon as a best business book of the year. It's also been on the New York Times bestseller list for months and months. What kind of success have you seen thus far, and what kind of things have you heard in feedback from that book?
Well, the feedback has been pretty good, because what I'm trying to do is crack a little bit of a mystery. You know, when we make all kinds of decisions about when to do things, in our lives and in our work. So, when should we have this interview? When in the day should I do certain kinds of work? When in the day should I do other kinds of work? When in the day should I go for a run? When should I start a project? When should I abandon a project that's not working? When should I get, all these kinds of when questions, and we end up answering those questions, making those decisions, really based on intuition and guesswork. And that's the wrong way to do it. There's a rich body of evidence out there across literally 24 different disciplines that gives us the facts, the evidence, the data to make better, smarter decisions about when to do things, both in the terms of when in the day should we do certain things, which is a really important decision. When should we take a break? How do beginnings affect our behavior? How do midpoints affect our behavior? How do endings affect our behavior? How do groups synchronize in time? How does the very way we think about time shape what we do and how we do it? And so what I'm trying to do here is write a book that's not a how-to book, but a when-to book, that's rooted in science, because we don't have to make these decisions in this default, intuitive, guesswork, patchwork, haphazard way.
Sure. So, just from being an author, from a marketing perspective alone, this being your 6th book, how has marketing those books changed for you? I mean, if you consider, I think Free Agent Nation was published in 2001. That would, that's
yes, exactly.
kind of the Stone Age for a lot of people.
Yeah.
When you think about
absolutely.
content. But I know that content talking about free agents is as relevant today as it was then. As you know, as an author alone, you must have recognized just some major changes in marketing your published works. How have you? What have you seen of
totally.
that?
Absolutely. On a whole variety, it's on so many different dimensions, Shark. So many different things. So, um, at the very least, in 2001, it's so monumental when you think about it. Okay, so in 2001, there was not even widespread broadband. Okay,
Right.
so you had far fewer people buying books, learning about books online. So that was a less integral part of the strategy, which seems quaint now when you think about it, given how many people either buy a book online or encounter a book online or learn about a book online or actively seek information about a book online. It's not surprising, but 17 years later, just the amount of attention that goes into things that are online is monumentally different. And that's
even the book itself. I mean, everything would have been on paper only in 2001.
Right. There were no ebooks, and that's actually a really interesting point too. When you look at the trajectory of books themselves, something very, very interesting. Well, let me get to another point, and I'll build on that. So the other thing, again, in 2001, is that we didn't have smartphones.
Right.
And so what's happened now is that for my first couple of books, when we think about something like the cover, okay, that's a big marketing decision, right? What is the look and feel? What is the identity? It's essentially a brand for a book. What is the identity? We think about that very differently now than we did back then. For instance, one of the most important things for a book cover today is how does the cover look on the phone? It's not a matter of how does it look on a shelf in a store. It actually, what's more significant is how does it look in, 3 centimeter by 3 centimeter, and that actually has changed some of the aesthetics, the identity of book covers. And then, of course, there is social media, which is how people talk about stuff. And so that becomes important in, can you participate in some of these conversations in which the topics of your book are relevant? Equally important, I think, again, books as a product, is can you listen in on the conversation? So, you can put, it's possible to search a Twitter, for instance, and say, okay, how many people are talking about this book and what are they saying? And that was not possible then. And then, one of the most important things is with essentially every audience, every offering rather, is how you communicate with your audience. And Seth Godin figured this out 20 years ago when he talked about quote unquote permission marketing. And so, there's a reason why I have a regular email newsletter, and that's a way for me to keep in touch with readers in a way that was more difficult way back then. So, like so many things in the world, the actual marketing of the book is very different. Oh, let me pick up on one last thing. Sorry. You talked about ebooks, and there were no ebooks or almost no ebooks in 2001. And one of the things that I've seen, and my experience as a writer, and the data that I have on my work as a writer, is very similar to the total data on books, or most books at least, is that there was an increase, not insignificant increase in ebooks, but that has really plateaued and maybe even dipped a little over the last 4 or 5 years. What has really taken off in a surprising way in the last 4 years, especially 3 or 4 years, is audiobooks, and that's largely because people can listen to them on their phones and they can play them on their cars. Now, this is going to sound preposterous, but Free Agent Nation had an audiobook, and that Free Agent Nation audiobook, the delivery mechanism was, get ready for this, cassette tapes.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, can you believe that?
That.
And so, like, my kids were not even, I'm not even joking about this. One of my kids saw a cassette tape and didn't know what it was. And so that's a sort of really interesting, unexpected thing, is that, audiobook sales are doing really, really, really well. and it's largely because of the combination of the smartphone and the ability to hook up your smartphone to a car. I even remember, now we're talking 15 years ago, to some extent, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that if you wanted to listen to an audio, I could never listen to an audiobook in the car because by the time I got to the second CD, I didn't know which was, like, am I on the second CD? I'm on the third CD? Where, it was very hard it was not a user-friendly thing. And so I think it's really, really interesting in this unexpected way that we've had these things called audiobooks for a long time. But what's really given them a lot of propulsion in the last 3 or 4 years are smartphones connected to cars.
Well, you could probably feel the liver spots bursting on your hands as you were explaining to them what a cassette tape was. So, and good young guys like us, you're often a keynote speaker, and I first had the pleasure of hearing you speak at a digital marketing conference. And in your mind, why does this book have an appeal to marketers? I mean, I completely get it, especially after reading it. However, I'd really love your point of view on why When resonates to a marketer.
Well, at one level, marketers are human beings who do work. And one part of the book, the first chapter, or arguably the first 2 chapters, has to do with how do we organize our days to get the most and best work done. And so that's something that whether you're a marketer, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a physicist, whatever, that's something that's germane. So it's important on there. When you widen out to some of the other dimensions of timing, particularly things dealing with the episodic nature of timing, that if you think about even a marketing campaign is episodic. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end, right? Even the life of a product has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so all 3 of those different moments, beginnings, middles, and ends, exerts a different effect on our behavior. And marketers who are conscious of, okay, what is the effect of beginnings on our behavior? Are there some times that are better to, quote, to launch a project than other times? What about midpoints? We know that midpoints have a dual effect. Sometimes they bring us down. Sometimes they fire us up. If you're a marketer, how do you understand the difference between those 2 different effects, and how do you respond to it? Then you think about something like endings. I mean, endings are so monumentally important for marketers because what we know about endings is that endings can get us to energize, it can get us to act. So certain kinds of short deadlines and short fuses for marketers can get customers and prospects to act in a way that other kinds of mechanisms don't. We know from a marketing perspective how much endings affect the way we encode entire experiences. And when I say encode, I mean how we evaluate those experiences and how we remember those. And so if you look at something just as mundane as Yelp reviews of restaurants, a disproportionate number of Yelp reviews for restaurants, if you just look at it just anecdotally, focus on what happened at the end of the meal. And they use that to evaluate the entire meal. So, endings are incredibly germane to marketers. And then, one of the things about endings is that endings also can trigger a search for meaning. We're looking for some uplift on endings. And so marketers who are conscious of that, who construct experiences and offerings that are intentional about how the offer ends, how the experience ends, are going to do a lot better. So fortunately, I mean, I've heard from a lot of marketers about this book. It gives them, what I like to think is that it just gives them another lens through which to examine their own work and several more tools to actually do their own work.
Absolutely. I mean, I know when I think of timing in marketing, you so often just think of the timing of, say, an email blast or when to day part a TV ad or something like that. But,
exactly.
You've really got to look behind the scenes. And I think this is where that book started to open my eyes a little bit, to think of it more of, an art to the science, if you will, as you speak about.
Yeah, exactly.
So talk a little bit, if you will, to start exploring it. As we start diving a little bit deeper into the book, talk a little bit, if you will, about how mood follows a fairly predictable pattern throughout the day.
Yeah, so what we know, you got it exactly right. There is a fairly predictable, in large populations, when we take the whole large numbers of people and measure them all together, what we see is that mood typically follows, mood and performance, which are linked, typically follow a three-stage frost pattern. There's a peak, a trough, and a recovery. So if you look at various studies on mood, our mood tends to go, again, not each individual, but over an entire population, our mood tends to go up early in the day, then declines around the middle of the day, then recovers again later in the day. So there's a peak, a trough, and a recovery. And what's interesting about this pattern of mood is that it's been found by many different researchers in many different fields using many different methodologies. That is, some of them aren't even aware that they are asking the exact same questions. And so, for instance, just in that presentation that you're talking about in Philadelphia, I talked about a study out of Cornell and then a study out of Princeton. And I actually talked to some of the Princeton researchers and who had done research on this pattern of mood, and it turned out they had no idea about this Cornell study because it was in a different field, even though they were asking very very similar questions. So what we know about the pattern is that we have a peak, a trough, and a recovery, and that pattern of mood gives us some clues about the best time of day to do our work.
I've got two questions on this next part, and one of my favorite chapters in the book is chapter 5, and it was Endings, Marathons, Chocolates, and the Power of Poignancy. And, you know, for most people, I'm going to kind of start, I just thought this was really relevant, and I know you covered it both in the book and in your presentations, but for most people that enter a marathon, it mentally takes, you know, so much planning and discipline and motivation.
Yeah.
Not only on top of the physical toils it takes on your body to train for a 26.2 mile run, but however, discuss, if you will, a little bit on when people are most motivated to compete in a marathon.
Yeah, this is some really fascinating research from Adam Alter at NYU and Hal Hirschfield at UCLA that looked at the age at which people are most likely to run their first marathon. Okay, what are the age at which people are most likely to run their first marathon? And it turns out the most common age was 29. It turns out that another extremely common age was 39. It turns out another extremely common age was 49. And if you start digging a little deeper beneath the surface, it turns out that 29-year-olds are twice as likely to run a first marathon as 30-year-olds. Turns out that 49-year-olds are 3 times as likely to run a first marathon as 50-year-olds. And I think one of the things that this tells us is, again, the effect of endings on our behavior. When the end of something becomes visible, when we're able to glimpse the end, even of something as arbitrary as a life decade, we tend to kick a little harder. That these kinds of endings energize us to do stuff. And it's part of that motivational fuel is a search for meaning.
So another part that you brought up, and if you will elaborate on the research that you discussed in the book regarding chocolates, and I think that part is really, that example really plays well within marketing, because you also went into some details on, you know, if you run a sale through a certain date, when are the people going to show up? The first day it comes out or towards the very end? I mean, it was that I just found really fascinating. Would love for you to kind of go into some detail there.
Yeah, the chocolate research is really interesting. I love that one piece of research, and it's consistent with a larger body of research showing how this human preference for endings that have rising sequences rather than declining sequences. That when something ends, we want things to be going up rather than coming down, and also how endings monstrously shape how we evaluate things. So this is a great piece of research out of the University of Michigan, and what they did is they set up tables at the University of Michigan Student Center, and they claimed they were doing a taste test of Hershey's Kisses. And so they treated 2 groups of students differently. The first group they brought in and said, hey, do you want to do a taste test of Hershey's Kisses? And so they asked the student to rate it. Then they asked the student to rate another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, and took the ratings on these chocolates. And the students in the first group, everybody got 5 chocolates, but they didn't know how many they were getting at the beginning. The second group, people, it was the same kind of thing. Hey, do you want to taste some chocolates made with local ingredients and rate them? Here's your first chocolate. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. And what they did in this case is they identified the fifth chocolate as the last chocolate. Here is your last one. And that was it. And now, again, these chocolates are all made with the same ingredients. There's no differences among the chocolates. And what happened is that when the chocolate was identified to that second group as the last chocolate, people loved it. They loved it more than any chocolate they ate. They loved it more than any chocolate anybody ate. But simply identifying this as the last chocolate boosted people's ratings of that chocolate by about, let me see, it was about 6 or, yeah, I mean, pretty significantly, almost by, yeah, like probably roughly 20%.
It's crazy. And if you think about things you see online, you know, and you put that same kind of, think of it as ad copy next to it, you would jump at the opportunity to get something like that if you knew there was a limited amount left. And it's just knowing that, as if you look at A/B testing that, you're in all likelihood going to see those same types of results in your advertisements.
Right. Well, that's actually a really good point on all of this, is that, you know, especially for digital marketing, the ability to A/B test is essential. I actually think that A/B testing is one of the most important things happening in business right now, that it's going to leap well beyond marketing to other aspects of business, and that in many ways, you know, business leaders need to start thinking like scientists. That is, you know, scientists don't know all the answers, but what do scientists do? Scientists have they know they have knowledge. They use that knowledge to make hypotheses, and then they go out and test the hypotheses.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what an A/B test is. And so, you know, I think that A/B testing is going to go from beyond, do people like a rectangular button or a square button? You know, to things fundamental about leadership, about you know, basically every element of business. And this is one reason why I think that it's very important for the popular writing about business and marketing and leadership and all that to be rooted in science, because knowing the science is going to allow us to make better hypotheses. Knowing how scientists work is going to allow us to do this A/B testing better. And there's a lot of wisdom, quote unquote, out there that is just stuff that's spouted out and never tested.
Exactly.
Never tested in an academic laboratory, and certainly never tested in an A/B test inside of a firm. And that, to me, is absolutely where this world is going.
Well, and what got me excited about it, I think this is where it really started to resonate with me, and I can't even think how many advertisements or landing pages or creative that I've seen that I've worked on where where you change up something, you change one headline copy to another on a Google ad, or you change one piece of creative on a landing page or some billboard somewhere else, but what you don't really take into account enough, and I think why this book really resonated with me, is you don't think about using timing enough as some sort of clickbait, if you will, that really shows the incentivization of people to procrastinate and seek that happy ending.
Exactly.
And that's what I really enjoyed about it. So let's go into a little bit different detail then and talk about when companies release earnings statements. That was an example you both brought up in the presentation, and then I remember reading about as well. But you talk about when certain times of day that companies need to release earnings statements, and what other types of communications and corporate communications, social media, etc. Where do you see that science can provide some insight into when companies should communicate to their audience, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Well, that piece of research you're referring to is a study out of NYU on it's a big data analysis of the transcripts of 26,000 earnings calls. So these are the quarterly calls that public companies are having to announce their earnings, to give guidance on future quarters, et cetera, et cetera. And it turned out, this is a pretty amazing piece of research, that calls using this, not even that sophisticated form of text analysis, but using a form of text and software that is essentially a massive text analyzer. These researchers were able to show that calls in the afternoon were more negative, irritable, and combative than calls in the morning, even if you adjusted for the fundamentals. So even with whether they're reporting good news or bad news, calls in the afternoon were more negative, irritable, and combative than calls in the morning, to the point where it actually had an effect short term on the stock price. And this is just how important these daily rhythms are. I mean, what we know is that our cognitive abilities don't stay the same throughout the day. They change. They change in important ways. They change in somewhat predictable ways. And so when you're releasing your earnings calls, not all times of day are created equal, period. And what this research shows is that there's actually a fairly good argument for doing important corporate communications, including earnings calls, early in the day rather than later in the day.
So, and I'm assuming this same thing applies even internally with teams people work with. And are there any best practices on, when to be creative, when to schedule a meeting with others? What kind of tips and things do you run
absolutely.
into?
Okay, so there's all kinds of good stuff on that. So when we think about, let's get back to the rhythm of the day. So we mentioned earlier, the day has essentially three basic stages: a peak, a trough, a recovery. Most of us move through the day in that order: peak early in the day, trough middle of the day, recovery later in the day. The 25% of us who are out, have what are called evening chronotypes, that is, we wake up late, go to sleep late, just naturally we are owls. They're much more complicated. They tend to have, and then the world is not built for them, unfortunately. So owls tend to hit their peak late afternoon, early evening, well into the evening. But what we know is this, and I think it's really important for meetings, which is during the peak, which again for most of us is early in the day. For owls, it's later in the day. That's when we're most vigilant. That's when we're able to knock away distractions, which makes it the best time to do work that requires heads down focus. Analysis, writing, analyzing data, etc. The trough, which for almost all of us is the early to mid-afternoon, that's a terrible time of day. All kinds of bad stuff happens there. We mentioned some of the decline in, some of the problems with earnings calls. You see huge negative healthcare consequences in the afternoon, for everything from doctors over-prescribing antibiotics to nurses in hospitals not washing their hands in the afternoon compared with the morning, to more surgical errors. It's really frightening. And then during the recovery, it's actually, I think, a really interesting period, especially for marketers, because during that recovery period, again, for most of us, that's later in the day into the early evening. What happens there is that our mood is back up. However, we're not as vigilant as we were earlier. But that can be a really potent combination. So if our vigilance is low, we have fewer inhibitions, and our mood is greater, that makes it a good time for brainstorming, things like that, things that require more iterative thinking, things that require a greater mental looseness. And so what we should be doing where we can, and for those of your listeners who are leaders who configured the schedules themselves, is let people do their analytic heads down work during their peak, shift all the administrative nonsense, routine emails, TPS reports to the trough, and then during the recovery, focus on the more brainstormy, iterative, creative kinds of tasks. And the problem is that when we, exactly as you said, when we schedule meetings, we don't do that. We just look to see who's available and is there a room open.
Yeah.
And we don't ask the question of, what kind of meeting is this? What kind of mental capacities do we want our people to have? Who's going to be there? We just go. We think of scheduling meetings. We think of the scheduling of meetings as a purely logistical, logistical administrative task, and it's not. And again, if there's one thing that I would emphasize from this research, particularly on the unit of the day, is that our brain power doesn't stay the same throughout the day. Our cognitive abilities are not static throughout the day. They change. They change in ways that are reasonably predictable. Equally important, they change in ways that can be extreme. And so if you're not taking that into account, you're not being strategic.
Could not agree more. And I when I read this in the book, I was fascinated just thinking to myself, when has anybody ever scheduled a meeting based on when people would be the most productive? That's
Nope.
non-existent. And
Never.
those 3 cycles in the day for many people are
Yeah.
basically what somebody would, what a lot of people would consider, lunch, nap, and dinner. Unfortunately, whether how they're going to be productive. So,
Right.
last but not least, I'd love for you to kind of talk about some of the findings you've seen on career trajectories. I know a lot of marketers are going to aspire to either be a CMO leader or even a CEO, but talk about how timing affects people's career trajectory and some of the research you've seen.
Yeah, that's that ends up getting that ends up being somewhat trickier research to do because
Oh, I bet.
because you end up with so many variables, and it's hard to run an experiment. It's like, let's take 100 people and say, you run your career this,
Sure.
you do your career this way, and you guys, you do your career that way. So it's trickier. That doesn't mean we don't have insights on them. And I think one of the important insights has to do with actually, I think one of the most important, I say this as the father of 2 college students, is how much, and this, I really changed my view on this, is how much the beginning of one's career matters on a number of different dimensions. One dimension is plain and simple wages. There is some astonishing research from Lisa Kahn at Yale showing that the labor market conditions, basically the unemployment rate, the year you graduate, for people who go to college, the year you graduate from college, that has an effect on what you will be earning 20 years later. It's just astonishing, and it has to do with exactly as you say, Shark, about the trajectory. That's exactly the way to think about this, because here's what we know. Early in our careers, and this is true for marketers, but it's true for everybody. Early in our careers, what we're doing in the labor market in many ways is we're looking for the right match between our skills and employers' demands. And that's very hard to get straight out of the box. Very rarely do you take your first job and say, oh my God, this job is a perfect match for my skills. and the employer is saying, oh my God, this person's skills are a perfect match for my needs, right? So there's a matching thing going on there, and it's difficult. It's going to be imperfect. And one way that on the employee side, on the worker side, that people get it right is by switching jobs. All right, hey, this is not quite a match, but maybe I'll try this thing. The other thing that we know is that when people switch jobs, switching jobs is actually a good way to get a salary increase. And so if you are able to, early in your career, to make a decent number of switches, what's going to happen is that you're going to move faster to getting the right match for your skills, and each time you switch jobs, you're going to get an incrementally higher salary in general. The trouble is that if you graduate in a recession, you already start out with a disadvantage, because your first job is probably going to be less great of a match. If you're in a match that isn't ideal and the unemployment rate is high, it's going to be harder for you to switch jobs, which means that it's going to take you longer to find your right match. If you can't switch jobs, that's another way that you're not getting a salary increase. And so even those initial conditions in your job has a huge role, to the point where you can see it in people's wages 20 years later. Same thing is true. There's some interesting research out of business school that in business school, you're less likely to become CEO of a large company if you graduate from business school in a recession. And again, so one of the things about careers, which I really changed my mind on looking at this data, is that actually the beginning of your career actually matters. It really does. And unfortunately, much of the beginnings of careers is out of your hands because it has to do with the economic conditions. And there's some preliminary numbers coming in from Lisa Kahn and others about the students who graduated in that Great Recession era. They're not moving as quickly up the salary ranks as their predecessors who just happened to have graduated from college 3 years earlier.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially in the profession of marketing, where by nature of that industry, you see a lot of change throughout careers. It's not like staying in an accounting or an engineering role that you stay pretty stable in for 10 to 20 years. I mean, marketers by nature change jobs often, so that trajectory starts just as you said. So, and I met you at a marketing conference. Why do you enjoy speaking at those types of conferences? I thought it was a great get by Digital Summit to pull you in. Very, very good thought leadership. But why do you find that an appeal to speaking at a marketing conference?
Well, I mean, part of it's marketing, part of it's just being out. I'm a writer, and so so I'm talking to you here in my office in Washington D.C. My office is the garage behind my house. It is a refurbished garage. The walls are thick and basically hermetically sealed. So I'm in this thing that is very reminiscent of a bubble, and I do my little work here in this bubble, and then I throw it out into the world. And like any good marketer, like any good creator, I want to get feedback on what I have to say. And so, with a book, it goes out into, thousands, we hope tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's hands, and maybe they'll give you some feedback. But when you go out and talk about it in public, right away what people are finding compelling and what people are not. You can look around a room and say, oh my God, no one is taking notes about that. That's so interesting. I thought that was so interesting. Or you can say, why is everybody taking notes about this? Why is everybody taking a photograph of that slide? And it just gives you really, really great feedback on what part of your, which of your ideas are clear and compelling and which are not. Likewise, what I have found is that when people ask questions, I learn a lot more about the current material, and it also raises questions that sometimes will lead to subsequent projects.
Yeah, I agree, and I watch people taking notes during your presentation. And watching you with your $129 clicker that wouldn't work. I still remember that. But Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I highly encourage everyone to go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or anywhere to get a copy of this book. I don't normally do that, but as I said, it really resonated with a lot of things that I look at in practice of marketing. Where can people follow and find out more about you and the Dan Pink brand?
You can go to my website, which is danpink.com, DANPINK.com. I'm also on Twitter at Daniel Pink, at Daniel Pink. You can also go to danielpink.com. Go to danielpink.com, at Daniel Pink. Put Daniel Pink into the Google. You'll find me.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan, for speaking with us again about when on A Shark's Perspective.
Thanks for having me, Kenneth.
So there was my conversation with Daniel Pink, the best-selling author of 6 provocative books, including When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from our conversation with him. First, when you think of the timings of campaigns, did you know that endings have an effect on our behavior? And I quote, when the end of something becomes visible, when we're able to glimpse the end, even as something as arbitrary as a life decade, we tend to kick a little harder. These kind of endings energize us to do stuff, and part of that motivational fuel is a search for meaning. So whether you're thinking of running a marathon or deploying a campaign, make sure that you keep in mind when your customers are most motivated. Second, we think of scheduling meetings as purely a logistical task, but when was the last time someone scheduled a meeting during a time when it would be the most productive? Our brain power doesn't stay the same throughout the day. Our cognitive powers change and are reasonably predictable even to an extreme. If you're not taking that into account when you're thinking about a marketing meeting, then you're not being strategic. Third, whether it's an advertisement, a campaign, a marketing meeting, or a career choice, looking at timing and the science of when can give you another lens in order to examine your own work and another tool in your tool set for when to do your best work. The trajectory of your own career could be dependent upon it. Got a question? Please feel free to find me on LinkedIn or send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this show regarding another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. So now is the time for you to go be an even better marketer. If not now, then the question is when. Join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.